Should men and women train differently? How do you adjust your program around your menstrual cycle? And can you still train through pregnancy? To help us answer these questions, we invited Dr. Travis Triplett onto the podcast. She's one of the world's leading researchers in women's strength and conditioning, former president of the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and a weightlifting coach of over 30 years. And let me tell you, we learned a ton. So if you're a coach, an athlete, or a parent, you're going to love this episode. Welcome back to the Last Set, Best Set podcast. I'm Coach Brian. I'm the owner of Big Ben Strength. I'm here today with Coach Calvin Lackey. He is a university national champion and Lindenwood team captain for weightlifting. And I'm really excited because today we're going to be interviewing Dr. Travis Triplett on all things women's strength and conditioning. So she has a PhD in physiology of exercise and a master's in exercise science. She's also the former president of the NSCA and has been a USA weightlifting coach since 1992, which is kind of crazy because that's since before both Calvin and I were born. So tons of experience here. We're really excited to have you come on. Do you mind giving us a little bit of a background on how you got into strength and conditioning and weightlifting coaching?
Well, I guess really, I think it was probably my first weight training class in college. I just fell in love with it, because back when I was in high school, girls didn't really, I think lifting for female athletes was just barely getting started. And so I took a weight training class and fell in love with it. And then when I sought out places to do my master's degree, I ended up actually here where I now work. But Dr. Mike Stone, who, has background in weightlifting as well as periodization, that's, being his kind of main thing that his career's focused on. He really taught me the, weightlifting movements. I had not really done those prior to meeting him. And so I think it just took off from there. Then I ended up out at the Olympic Training Center. There was resident weightlifters out there that we worked with. I was in the sports physiology lab. And then, obviously as I continue my education, I've never really strayed too far away from just the field of strength and conditioning in general, but also just understanding the importance of weightlifting movements for athletic performance in sports outside of weightlifting as well. So just having to, teach that to the students that are in the broader field of strength and conditioning.
So I didn't know that you were at the Olympic Training Center. What time period were you there?
So that was just for 1 year. It was from 1989 to 1990. And it was back when they don't have this program anymore. They had this program where people that were finishing their master's degree could come out and do a year-long research assistantship. And so they had research assistants in sports physiology, which is where I was based, but they also had research assistants in biomechanics, engineering, computer science, and sports psychology. And so that we were all kind of a similar age, and, all we did was test athletes. And the staff there were the ones that really spent more time with the coaches and the athletes going over the results and trying to help plan the training. But, we were the lab rats, I guess. But, it gave me an insight into sports that I really had previously had no exposure to whatsoever. And, living in Colorado Springs wasn't too shabby either.
Yeah, Colorado. We just got back from Colorado Springs for nationals, and it's beautiful there.
Yeah, it is.
As far as what you're up to now, you're professor at Appalachia State, right?
Yes.
And now, if I'm correct, didn't Mike Stone, he once taught there, right? Or he had
in fact, he was my master's degree, my master's thesis mentor. So he came in my second year of my master's program. And so, and he stayed here for quite a while. And then he and his wife got an opportunity to go over to the UK, and she was hired by the Scottish, I think, track and field or something with Olympic level athletes. And then they came back and they worked at the Olympic Training Center for 3 years. And then they ended up at East Tennessee State, which is where they still are. So, but yeah, I've known Doc Stone since 1988, maybe.
Wow. And he's a legend in strength and conditioning research.
Yes.
Just about anybody who is a coach was either influenced by him or influenced by somebody who was influenced by him. So that's pretty interesting.
Here's a funny story about meeting Mike Stone at NSCA Nationals. This is my first national conference, and I was presenting a poster board on some weightlifting research we had done. And the session was just starting, and Dr. Stone was walking by. I'm like, hey, Dr. Stone, how's it going? Like, I want to show you this real quick. And as I'm saying that, the pins from my poster board pop out, and my poster like folds into like this like curled up thing, and I'm like fumbling with it. I'm like, oh, so basically we did this, and he's like, he's laughing at me, and just he shared a little bit of knowledge he had on what we did, but it was kind of an embarrassing way to first meet him. So
That's okay. He for sure won't remember that forever, so that's good.
um,
So
That's great.
the kind of the main topic that we wanted to cover today is strength and conditioning for women and how it's different for men than women. And I think one of the biggest assumptions, at least this is what I've heard kind of my entire career in weightlifting when it comes to the differences between training men and women, is that women can handle more training volume than men can. And that's kind of just been a really popular statement, but is that actually true? And what do you know about that?
Well, I do think there's some support for that, and it really just comes from a multitude of studies that maybe they weren't trying to investigate that specifically, but that ended up being, especially with training studies, that the females tolerated the higher volume phases of a program a little better than the males. And I think some of it's rooted in, if you look at the average female compared to the average male, there's often a slightly higher percentage of the slower twitch, fatigue resistant muscle fibers in the female athlete. And I think we're seeing that, especially in, we're obviously here to talk more about strength and conditioning and weightlifting, but we're seeing that in things like ultra endurance events where females are actually, winning or competitive or placing higher than the male athlete. So I mean, there's a whole lot of other things going on with the cardiorespiratory system. But anyway, back to, so I think it is rooted in some maybe differences in how muscle fibers distributed, and then all the stuff that goes along with that, from the metabolic side of it to the cardiovascular side of it, oxygen delivery and all that. But I also think that it still probably boils down to the individual athlete. So especially at the elite level, when you have people that are competitive in strength and power sports, you're probably not going to see that as much because their years of training and probably their physical parameters that selected them into strength power sports to begin with are probably going to erase some of that difference. But yeah, I think it's possible, but then when you look at it more on an individual level, it might not hold up. But I think, if you're looking at more of a global group level, I think there are some trends there that do support that.
And would you think that maybe body weight, like if equated for body weight, would that change? So would similar weight class men and women be able to handle different amounts of volume, or is that more like, are those actually a little bit more tied together?
That's a good question, because you can look at just relative body weight, and then you can also look at relative lean body weight. And so I think that the more you isolate it, I think the differences get smaller and smaller.
Taking a quick break from the episode to let you know about the OlyStrong team. The OlyStrong team is my online group coaching option for lifters who are looking to improve their technique, get strong, and set PRs. It includes your choice of 3 or 5 days a week of workouts, daily video feedback, and unlimited coach messaging to ask as many questions as you'd like for less than $1 a day. If you're ready to get started, then click the link in the description below for a free week trial today. All right, back to the show.
And that's just true in general for strength, but I think it could also be true for endurance as well. And then there's things like muscle distribution. We know that female athletes, on the whole, people that are highly trained, you see this less, but on the whole, there's a little bit less muscle mass in the upper body in your average female. And even, that may hold up in certain sports for female athletes. But, then you look at strength power sports where there's a lot of weight training involved, that may not be the case anymore. So we don't have a lot of good data on it specifically. Like I mentioned at the beginning, that these things were trends that were noticed in studies that were actually looking at other parameters. But I think there's some merit to it. But again, I think it probably really just more depends on what you're trying to train for and what phase of training you're in. And I don't know that it requires a whole lot of adjusting to, what you're trying to accomplish.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Originally, like when this question kind of first popped into my brain, that was kind of my explanation for it was okay, on average, women are just smaller than men. And on average, even at the same body weight, they're going to have a little less lean mass.
Mm-hmm.
And so that in my mind, and I'm not even sure if there's research to support, even just in men, higher weight class individuals or very heavy individuals being able to handle less volume than really lightweight individuals. That's a trend that I feel like maybe I notice on my own. But that was kind of my explanation for it. And then when I saw your presentation at NSCA, one of the first things you started off with is so many of these differences, these observed sex differences, are because of body size.
Yeah.
So do you want to expand on that a little bit? Like what kinds of other differences do you see maybe as a result of body size?
Well, there's the obvious ones. If you go, kind of very internal, you got the skeletal differences. Women are going to have wider hips and smaller shoulders and they're going to be shorter in height. And then some of the limb lengths will be, proportionally different. Then you get to the musculature, which we've kind of all been talking about, where women have more of their muscle mass distributed in the lower body, which when you then start to look at sex differences relative to lean mass, they pretty much go away. And then we get into like the metabolic differences and which I'm kind of lumping in cardiorespiratory as well, because, women have smaller hearts and smaller lungs and all these things, but then they compensate by burning fat longer. And so, but yeah, if you look at, let's just take world records, female athletes are always going to have, lower VO2s, or they're going to take longer to complete a, like a distance or something, if it's a running or a cycling or a swimming type of race. So yeah, these differences do exist, but at the same time, it's like, and I think the point I was trying to make in my talk was, okay, yeah, there's differences, but does it really impact how you design your training program? It's just, you just need to understand that there's differences, and the performance expectations should be, in the context of those differences, but does that mean you really change your training? And so that's kind of where I was going with that talk. But yeah, so I think I'm just thinking back to a few differences, with the less hemoglobin, women are more prone to having low hemoglobin or getting anemic, things like that. But those are all things that can be fixed with diet and, other maybe supplements, things like that.
That makes sense. So you were mentioning that whether or not it should affect your training program, should it? What were some of the findings from that?
I think most of the time, no. I mean, it just gets back to that needs analysis, which we all, have to do as coaches. It's like, okay, what does this athlete need? And everybody's just a little different. Yes, there are some kind of standard universal things that we do with all, athletes that are training for a particular type of, sport. But those just slightly more subtle differences that are the variations from person to person, athlete to athlete, that's where the program adjustments would occur. But it's usually nothing too crazy. It's like not like you're going to write a completely different program when you've got two athletes training for the same type of, event or sport. And so I think earlier, well, you go back to the history in the Olympics, they didn't want women to run any distances longer than 800 meters because they thought their uteruses would fall out or it would impact their ability. I mean, we laugh now, but people actually believe that women's ability to reproduce would be negatively affected if they ran more than 800 meters. And thank goodness we've progressed beyond that. But, I think, yes, we've slowly realized over years, and sometimes the research has been specifically looking at this, most of the time it hasn't. We've slowly realized that no, there really aren't that big of differences in training. It just boils down to, that needs analysis. Oh, you need more upper body strength. Okay, let's do that. You need more landing mechanics training. Okay, let's do that. It really is not dependent on whether someone is a biological male or a biological female.
Interesting. Interesting. Anything else that you kind of want to cover as far as the training differences between men and women?
I mean, I guess the one thing though I should mention is we can't, at least not yet, we're getting better, because I think there are more and more females participating in strength and conditioning activities, and also Olympic lifting, weightlifting competition and training, earlier and earlier. But we can't really totally ignore the fact that there's still an exposure problem, that females are not getting the same amount of exposure to these training methods, at least not at the same time, or maybe just the sheer amount of exposure. They're just not. And part of that's the whole psychosocial aspect of training, which I'm definitely not an expert in that, but people do look at this and try to figure out, look, how can we promote these very beneficial activities or these pathways for athletic competition, and training in young females. And then obviously those folks, if they do get involved early on, then yes, they are able to reach their genetic, kind of potential. They come a lot closer to that. Just like a lot of male athletes have been doing for a much longer period of time.
Absolutely. I mean, we look at like some of the top female athletes right now, Maddie Rogers, Olivia Reeves, right? These are athletes that both started at a much younger age, in weightlifting, and they're much better at the sport, more than likely because of that.
Yeah, there's something to be said for training history. I mean, that's why they say training age, they look at that different to biological or chronological age.
Yeah, I remember seeing a page. It's called Evidence Strong on Instagram, and they posted a couple graphics, and it was showing the age that every Olympic medalist in weightlifting started weightlifting. And in the 2020 Olympics or 2021 Olympics, there was a lot higher distribution of women that started later on, and I believe like even some of them starting around 20 or 21 years old, starting weightlifting. To become an Olympic medalist in those 2021 Olympics. And then I saw the results for Paris, and it had already maybe skewed a little bit. It's a very small sample size, but you could already see it maybe kind of consolidating to be a more similar distribution. Like obviously there's a lot of international systems that start men, selecting them at a very young age to go into these sports systems. But it would seem like other countries are kind of adopting that model for women as well, like China specifically being one of them.
Oh yeah.
So they have a pretty successful women's program.
And I've been in China and seen that. They study in places. They're not living at home. They're studying, and going to school and training. That's all they do. And I'd gone over to do some talks to some coaches. It was something that the NSCA, National Strength and Conditioning Association, they had, were working with partnerships. And so several of us went over and gave talks. But yeah, we could see, much like the Eastern Bloc countries in the 70s, they started training people very young. They talent identified, you can't predict everything, but they talent identified people, and tried to work towards a long-term training plan.
Is that something that you think is lacking in the United States?
I don't think we've ever really been able to do that well here, and for lots of reasons. I think there's a lot of cultural differences, and just government. Our whole Olympic program is privately funded. It's not government funded. Whereas you look at these other countries that have been more successful in training people for longer times, and their whole system is under governmental control. So we're talking, East Germany and China and the Soviet Union, which is obviously split up now, but several countries that were part of that. So yeah, it's just different. It is just very different. And people can argue what's good and what's bad, and what would actually be acceptable here versus there. And, I don't know as much about what's happening today. I've heard more about the training methods and things that were happening back in the 70s and 80s. Mainly because when I was at the Olympic Training Center, that's when the weightlifting coach, Dragomir, Saroslan, I think that's his last name. Anyway, he came
That's
from
correct.
Romania, and he had one of his lifters, Niku Vlad, who's now he was part of the, I guess, International Weightlifting Federation for a little while, and a more of a whatever their administrative structure, because obviously he's well past his competitive age. But yeah, so I've, met a lot of these people, and they were, in the US, and, you would see kind of how they trained and how they did things. And, so I'm a little more familiar with that. I wouldn't say I'm super familiar, but yeah, I think we've probably never really done that because our whole system is much more diffuse because of how things are funded.
That makes sense. And I've always kind of thought that that might be the case with
Yeah.
the US, where if we did have a system like that, I don't know that it would work quite as well here, or that
Yeah.
it could work quite as well here,
Yeah, I agree. I think it would be a challenge.
For sure. Okay, so we kind of want to get into this next topic, and when we asked our audience for what they wanted to hear from you, this was by and far the biggest topic that they wanted to cover, because I think a lot of people just don't have a whole lot of experience, and much less research-backed experience when it comes to it. So this second topic is broadly about how to navigate training around the menstrual cycle. So this is just about every single athlete and coach that I talked to. This is what they wanted to know about.
Right.
So am I correct? Did you present on some information on this recently?
I did. So this was a lot of the content of my talk, just because it's a hot area right now, and there are more and more studies coming out, and so we are actually starting to get a body of knowledge that we can make some reasonable conclusions from. And so I think we're going to see a shift. I think people are going to realize you don't have to worry about the hormones as much, but it's more about planning training around symptoms. Because, and as I pointed out in my talk, depending on what you're measuring in terms of performance. So are you looking at speed? Are you looking at power? Are you looking at hypertrophy? Are you looking at strength? It is so variable across the cycle, and there might be some trends, but they're really not very clear trends. And so on any given day, you can get a different reading. And so it is really very difficult to try to factor in what's happening in the menstrual hormones with how that is going to impact performance, and therefore try to train around that. And actually, I saw a study recently that they were finding that people that tried to overplan things around the menstrual cycle, just based on assumptions like, well, this hormone's going to cause them to be weaker, this hormone's going to cause them to, peak their agility. And I'm just throwing out examples here, but when they whoever was doing this was using a more well, okay, we know you're in this phase, so we're only going to do these movements for you this time. What it led to was actual detraining. And that's not what you want.
Right.
So I think they're starting to realize, look, let's get away from the hormone thing, because first of all, it's so variable, even within a person across their cycle, and even from day to day, you get all this variability. It's well, how do we work with this, And so, and getting away from that and talking about, well, on this day, if this hormone's this level, then their knee's going to be more lax. Well, we don't know that for sure. So
Can you talk about that? I think a lot of people might not know about differences in laxity and tendons at different phases of the menstrual cycle.
Yeah, and I think it's the evidence is very. There are some studies that have shown it, but it's just not really strong, and I think that's the problem. It's when does it become significant? And because there's statistical significance, but then there's also practical significance. And so I give the example like, okay, so in this part of my phase, I'm going to be able to lift 10 more pounds than I can lift in this other part of the phase. Does that even mean anything? And maybe for a sport like weightlifting, it does, absolutely, because that's the sport. But for most sports, it does not mean a thing, because it's within that range of, performance has so many other factors that feed into it. So if you're just slightly weaker, does that really impact your performance, especially in a sport like a field sport or a court sport or, other sports now, but there's obviously strength sports and that's a thing, but I think it still gets back to the variability within an individual person. I mean, I could induce the same difference if I keep you up half the night and give you crappy food to eat. And so I think it's all about the context of performance. And I think people kind of got a little crazy on the whole hormone thing, but we're just seeing that it's a mess. And not to mention the fact that if you really want to do it right, you have to track hormone levels every day. You can't just assume that because somebody is day 14 that this hormone's doing this and this other hormone's doing that. You just cannot make those assumptions. And that was some of the graphs I showed in my talk to show here's a normal menstrual cycle, but look at how all these, in terms of like the first, what we call the menstrual phase, where somebody's actively bleeding, and you say, okay, that's about 4 to 5 days long. So then after this, here's what we expect the hormones to do. But then I showed several figures where no, that's not actually what's happening. The patterns are there, but they could be stretched out. They could be shortened. They could be not happening at all, but you wouldn't know that without measuring like daily hormone levels, and who has the money for that?
Right.
So yeah, I think people are slowly, and there was a really good talk on the first day talking about, yes, planning training with the menstrual cycle, but not with the hormone levels, more with the symptoms. So when we talk about symptoms, we're talking about things like, cramping and nausea and bloating and sleep disturbances, and just people just don't feel good. And so coming in and saying, look, if the athlete's comfortable enough saying, look, coach, I'm having these symptoms, I just feel terrible, and then the coach going, okay, let me just tweak your workout here, we're going to do this instead of this, and then in a day or two they should be fine, and then get back to normal training, as opposed to, oh well, for this whole week and a half period we're gonna back off the volume. Oh, guess what, in 3 months we've actually detrained. So I think it's coming back to common sense, but also just what's realistic. We don't have funds to measure every woman's hormone levels every day of their cycle and then try to adjust it when you could be peaking on strength and doing worse on agility. And if that's your sport that needs both of those things, how do you reconcile your training in that case? So it's just kind of crazy complex. And I think we're going a little too far overboard with it. Let's just get back to common sense and talk more about symptoms instead of, and some women to hardly have any issues at all. And so for them, it's just another day. There was this rugby, and it was elite rugby athletes, female rugby players. And their conclusions were, yeah, we didn't need to adjust anything. These women were fine. And so it's just gotten out of hand.
That makes sense. Calvin, what were you going to say?
Oh yeah, I was thinking. I kind of, this was another takeaway I had after watching your talk. Was that probably coaches just need an auto regulation plan in place, and the reason behind that auto regulation plan doesn't necessarily even need to be specified in a lot of cases. Like you said, it could be really bad sleep and food and life stressors. You could be sick, or it could be as a result of menstrual cycle.
Yep.
But if you're having really bad symptoms, headache, cramps, fever, nausea, I don't know, you might be having a whole host of symptoms as a result of many different things. If that athlete feels they need to adjust their training, that coach should have a plan in place.
Yep.
Regardless of what that stressor is coming from. And I think there definitely, in my opinion, does need to be less of a stigma. So a female athlete could come to a male coach and say, hey, I'm on my period, I'm feeling this, like, can we adjust? And that coach also knowing, hey, this is a valid reason probably for adjusting if this athlete's coming to me telling me that.
Right.
Hey guys, quick interruption to the video to tell you about my 12-week weightlifting program. This program is something I put a lot of time and effort into, so be sure to go check it out. The program takes you through a few weeks of volume, strength phase, and then finally ends off with a peaking phase, ending out the program. It comes with a demo video showing you how the program works, how to use it, as well as exercise videos for all the complexes that are used throughout the program. Be sure to go check it out down below, and let's get back into the video.
And I think we're getting better about having those conversations, but yeah, they're difficult conversations to have. And but yeah, I think they're very necessary because yeah, like you said, if there was a personal issue or something that was impacting somebody's ability to, perform how they needed to in their training, that would easily be adjusted. And so why are we not doing the same thing for menstrual cycle issues?
Absolutely. I mean, any time that I've had an athlete that had poor sleep or poor nutrition for the day, we're adjusting our training there on the spot anyway. Like, that's just something that coaches hopefully should be doing on any given day. And whether it's the menstrual cycle or not that is causing those symptoms, then it doesn't matter. We should still be adjusting the training. That to me sounds like common sense. So that's interesting. One of the questions that we got was, what do you think a coach's minimum knowledge around a woman's menstrual cycle should be?
Well, and as I've, dug into this more, and the reason I dug into it more is because we were working on this female athlete position paper for the NSCA. And so we had to kind of bone up on, okay, here's what the research is showing today. Here's what we know and what we don't know. And so I think it's made all of us, re-examine, what is the minimum level of knowledge? And I think, now that I've looked at all this stuff, I think don't worry about what hormones are doing what when. That is really, it's too complicated. There's no, generalizable answers we can give. Everything's highly individualized, and it probably doesn't impact performance that much to begin with. So let's get away from that and let's get back to, okay, what is it about the menstrual cycle that's making it difficult for someone to train or someone to compete? And so then it gets back to the symptoms. And so, and again, those are typically focused in just like around a week or so. It could be a couple days leading up to the bleeding phase and then during the bleeding phase. And then after that, everything's pretty good for the next, 3 weeks or so. So it's not just the bleeding phase. It could be that few days leading up to that. But I think those would be the most important things to know. And then just with that individual athlete, what is their normal pattern of, when they maybe don't feel up to physically, pushing themselves, and just working with them on that.
Absolutely. Do you have any experience as far as adjusting nutrition around the menstrual cycle? Is that something that people should be considering?
And I'm going to say yes. Nutrition's definitely not my area, but there was a talk with her name's Katie Hirsch, and she's at University of South Carolina. And she did talk about this. She's got the nutrition background, and this was her talk, the whole talk. And I didn't get to see it because I had to go to something else. I don't know if it was a meeting or a talk, but and I think the conclusions were that she gave some suggestions for nutritional guidelines, around the menstrual cycle, but I couldn't tell you what they were.
Gotcha.
But I think with the ability to, I don't know if she put her slides on the app that we used for the conference, so that would be a resource. But I think that maybe there's some stuff coming out now that there would be some recommendations for nutritional guidelines
Gotcha.
around menstrual
Yeah,
cycle.
we'll have to
Yeah.
do some research on that. Find some more info on there. Okay, one of the symptoms I've found people talk about the most when it comes to training around their period, especially in weightlifting, is lower back pain.
Mm.
Is that something that we should be adjusting or training for? I'm assuming it is. One of the big changes that I'll usually make there is maybe changing pulls and doing pulling down a little bit of the volume on the pulls for that day, or the weight on the pulls, or even
Mhm.
changing the position, maybe doing something from the blocks instead. Is that something that people should be considering as well?
I think so, because the lower back, well, the back in general, but especially the lower back, it's so critical. You don't know how important your lower back is until you hurt it, and then you realize it does everything for you. So yeah, I think that would certainly be an area if some of those symptoms were specific, that low back ache.
Hmm.
You just don't want to push things to where then there would be some kind of strain injury, and then those are so slow to heal up. They're just these nagging things that they don't totally debilitate you, but they just make life miserable for a little while. So
Yeah.
certainly I would think that would be warranted, but I think usually those symptoms only last a day or two, so
Mhm.
it wouldn't be something that's really going to cost someone in terms of their preparation. In most cases, maybe if a meet was just around the corner, okay. But in general, if you're just looking at the whole training year, having, to back off a couple days each month is probably not going to be a problem.
And I think that that's a good point too. Is like adjusting training a day or two every now and then for something like this is actually not going to make that big of a difference long
No.
term, when it comes to training. And I think people may often more kind of freak out about that kind of thing. Um,
Oh, yeah.
and I try and remind people that, like, you didn't get strong in a week, you're not going to get weak in a week either. When it comes to taking time off or adjusting your training when needed. So hopefully that's helpful for some people.
Well, it's just like getting people to taper. They think, oh no, I'm just going to, I'm not going to be ready if I'm tapering. It's like, no, you got to let your body recover, and those adaptations actually take effect.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. You're not going to feel good during that taper, most likely.
yeah.
Yeah, they need to hit their openers a day or two out from the competition, or else they just gotta see if it's still there. They gotta make sure they still got it.
That's
Yep.
that's funny. Um, okay, Calvin, was there anything on this topic that you wanted to cover a little bit more?
Yeah, I think definitely from talking with my female athletes that I coach as well, we totally covered like a lot of the stuff that they wanted to know. I think a big emphasis, kind of what it felt like, is that in their past experiences, and this is just my couple of athletes I coach, what they said is that in the past maybe they were told by male coaches, "Oh, that doesn't matter," or "Oh, no, we don't need to worry about that. That's not something that we need to focus on." Um, and so I think a big takeaway for me as a coach is to tell them, yes, that does matter. If it matters to you, it should matter to me as your coach. And so being able to adjust, being flexible as a coach, that's kind of my big takeaway
Hmm.
for training around the menstrual cycle. Understanding, like Brian said, one day isn't making you stronger, and it's not making you that much weaker either. So knowing that if somebody feels like they need to adjust, and mentally that's like a good thing for them in that moment, then it's probably the best course of action, because it's very hard when you get a combative coach athlete relationship, when you're always telling this athlete to do something they don't want to do, or
Hmm.
advising them against what they think is their best practice. So I think working with someone when they bring this concern to a coach is probably the best course of action. At least being an open ear, listening, and being super open minded about it. Because what we learned too is that it's so individual. Some people are going to experience these symptoms, much worse, and others maybe not at all. So understanding what that athlete is dealing with is probably the most important thing, as well as knowing what all those other stressors in their life are, knowing
Hmm.
if they are sleeping, if they are eating well. Kind of that holistic coaching approach is super important.
And,
Uh,
and maybe just a little bit of advice for any coaches out there that are listening. Personally, I've just found that a lot of women just feel like, when they bring stuff up with their coaches or with their doctors or things like that, that they just feel dismissed a lot of the
Hmm.
time. And that is probably the biggest thing to try and avoid as a coach is you don't want your athletes to feel dismissed. You don't want to seem dismissive when it comes to talking about stuff like that, because otherwise they're not going to want or feel comfortable doing that. So help your athletes by being not dismissive.
And it just gets back to communication, and I think that's so critical for so many things. But like you said, that right there, the dismissive attitude will kind of wreck any kind of communication pretty quick. And then that can spill over into other issues. And then I'll just bring up, while we're still talking about the menstrual cycle and training, we haven't even scratched the surface on women who are taking oral contraceptives, because in a lot of ways they're good because they regulate the cycle. They provide hormones. Certain athletes are prone to having menstrual cycle disturbances. And so, by having an oral contraceptive, that kind of levels everything out. And then it can help with all the symptoms we're talking about. But you would need to know whether they were, on a oral contraceptive to really understand, what's happening with everything. So, and then like we said, or like I was trying to allude to just now, that then the whole pattern is changed because you're, artificially inducing hormones, but it regulates everything very nicely. And so you probably see fewer symptoms, but yeah, it just introduces a whole nother layer of complexity into how we understand how this all fits together. So
can we actually cover birth control and how that affects people's training a little bit? Because that is something that we had as a rapid fire question, but the more that you're talking about it, the more I'm thinking that might not be a rapid fire answer. So what are some things that people need to consider, especially for maybe younger athletes who are just starting to get on birth control while they're training?
Yeah. Well, and the challenge is there's not just one type of birth control. So you've got birth control, are these contraceptives that are a mix of the hormones that you see in the menstrual cycle, the estrogen and the progesterone. You've got oral contraceptives that are just one of those. I think there's some that are just either estrogen or just progesterone. I can't really remember. And then the dosing. And then, so some of it is what they call phasic. So you have 1 week on this dose, the next week on a different dose, the next week on a different dose. And then the final week, if you're assuming a 28-day cycle, which that, at least you can assume that on when you're on a contraceptive, an oral contraceptive. But, whereas you cannot assume that with just a naturally, natural menstrual cycle person. But that last week is the bleeding week. And so, or you could say that's the first week, but however you want to look at it. But so, and then there's others that the dose is the same throughout the whole cycle. And then, so you're 3 weeks on, one dose, and then the 1 week off is when the bleeding occurs. So it is so all over the board. And so that's what makes it difficult. I think the good news, though, is pretty much with all oral contraceptives, a lot of the symptoms that females will experience that are on a natural menstrual cycle, a lot of those are far better controlled. So you see less bloating, you see less cramping, you see, fewer headaches, or, you're far more stable. You just don't have these fluctuations in how you feel. And so that's the good news. And I think that's why some females go on contraceptives, irrespective of the contraceptive function of those, but to also manage just menstrual cycle symptoms in general, which especially in the early years, you mentioned that there's a lot of teens in your audience, that's when the menstrual cycle is so much more variable. I think once people hit their, early to mid 20s, it kind of stabilizes and it's not so crazy. But, in those early years, there's so many more things happening in the growth and development of the body, that the cycle itself is kind of all over the place as well. And so I think the symptoms can be more highly variable in that case.
One thing I realized a few years ago as a burnt out weightlifter is that there's no rules for how a weightlifting program is supposed to look. You don't have to push through heavy snatches and clean and jerks on a daily basis, especially if this is a hobby for you. That's when I made the switch to OlyBuilding, a style of training with a true 50-50 balance between Olympic lifting and bodybuilding. Not just a few sets of some accessory work that is, let's be honest, lazily picked at the end of the workout. So if you want to focus more on building muscle without losing your Olympic lifts, then check out the 8-week OlyBuilding program linked in the description below. And you can save 20% at checkout when you use the discount code LASTSETPOD. All right, back to the show.
So yeah, females that go on contraceptives to help kind of regulate all that, that could be a positive thing for training, because then it's just a lot more regulated. So
absolutely. What are some other things that people should consider as far as the menstrual cycle goes when it comes to weightlifting? I think one of the big topics that somebody mentioned was that you don't really have control over when a competition is going to be.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why training around the menstrual cycle is it's almost nuts, because unless somebody is on a contraceptive, and maybe if it's a, more individual sport like weightlifting, you can control like which meets you go to and things like that. But, you think back to a team sport, the schedule is set by some entity, some sport governing body or some collegiate, group. And so you don't have any say into which competitions you go to. So you just got to deal with it. And so, I think, it's definitely very specific to a certain type of athletic competition, whether you have much choice in when you compete or not. But yeah, otherwise, I think, people that eat, a balanced diet and, obviously these are athletes, they're training regularly. I think those things also can help with some of the symptomology. So maybe like I mentioned earlier, there's the one study I read just, a couple of weeks ago when I was putting the finishing touches on my talk. It was elite, like I said, rugby athletes, and they were like, yeah, we're good. We don't have any problems. And I don't, I'd have to go back to the paper to recall like how many of them were on some kind of contraceptive, but it's not like they were all on one. And so they were like, yeah, we're fit. We don't have a lot of issues with our menstrual cycles. Other than it being an annoyance, if you're in the bleeding phase and you have a competition, you got to make sure that you're, choosing the right hygienic products so you don't have, accidents, maybe in the middle of a match or something. But that's just more of an annoyance than I think anything else. So.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Calvin, do you have anything else on this topic that you want to get into before we get into the next one?
Yeah, real quick, another thing on birth control. Something that I've heard tossed around a few times. I think I've heard both sides of it. Some people saying birth control can decrease strength gains, and then other people saying no, like there's not that much evidence for that. Is that something a good bit about? Are you well versed in the research on that side of things?
I mean, we ran across all kind of research, and I think part of the problem is the populations that are being studied are so variable. Like what you see in elite athletes is not what's happening in the average person. And a lot of studies are in the average person. There's really a very big lack of studies in people that are more elite and have longer training histories and things like that. And so I think initially there were some trends seen, but then when they started doing more studies on more highly trained athletes, that those patterns were not holding up. And so it gets back to maybe we kind of jumped the gun on this hormone thing and read into it a little too much, and we need to kind of take a step back and not get too fixated on, oh well, I need to do this workout on this day because this is where I am in my phase. Because unless you measure your hormone levels that day, which are going to vary even within the day, you're not going to know. And then does it really matter? Is the difference in, let's say, strength or whatever, is it going to be big enough to make a difference in performance? And I kind of think no, but for most things. So yes, there is evidence out there, but it's not universal across the range of training levels that you see. So I think we need to maybe step back from that a little bit and not put too much weight on that.
Interesting. Okay, so I think let's go ahead and move into our next topic, training around pregnancy. This is something that a few of my athletes were interested in as well. Can you still train while pregnant? I feel like I know your answer on this already, but let's go ahead and do it. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know, Calvin saw the pictures. So I put some pictures up. There was one of she had to have been at least 8 months along doing a kettlebell snatch. And then there was one of my former students. She was doing a clean and she was 8 months along. And so, yeah, I obviously you wouldn't want to introduce somebody who's a novice, you know, weight trainer. I'll just use that term to certain, you know, maybe certain training programs or certain exercises if you know if they just become pregnant, and you want to be careful there. But if especially if you've got somebody that's experienced, I think we've seen perfect examples of females training well into pregnancy. And yeah, are there adjustments? Absolutely. There's some things happening with especially with some of the cardiovascular variables, because you know you have a whole lot more circulation going to that abdominal region, and so I know this because when I was doing my PhD, the wife of one of my fellow PhD students, she and I would lift together, and as she got further and further into her pregnancy, yeah, you can't do supine exercises, you can't lie down as easily, you get dizzy, and it's just not safe. But all she had to do was just turn it into an incline exercise. So instead of a flat bench, an incline bench, or, you know, something similar to that. And she was fine. So just little adjustments like that. Obviously, as people get larger and larger in that abdominal region, that's going to impact range of motion. So you can
maybe impact bar path a little bit too.
Yeah, it's going to change the bar path. It's going to change the, you know, the depth of, or just the range of motion that you'd be able to complete in a movement. But it doesn't mean, okay, well, now I need to stop. No, you can keep doing stuff. You're just doing quarter squats instead of full squats, or you're, you know, having to compensate for that shift in your center of gravity, you know, that's forward. And you might have to do, you know, maybe you do more front squats or something, you know, where you're sitting back a little more and keeping that balance. Balance is an issue, but it's just because of the body changes. And otherwise, I think, now granted, later in pregnancy, there's, you know, hormones being released to kind of loosen up the ligaments in the body to prepare for the birth process. But, you know, it's just, I think listening to your body, and then also being aware of things that okay, maybe I don't need to be doing this particular exercise at this point. I can do something else instead. And that would be more appropriate.
And that's something that I've heard in regards to like loosening up the ligaments. So I've heard that you should avoid doing more like single leg exercises, specifically like something like a box step up, once you get further along in the pregnancy because of ligament laxity. Is that something that people should consider, or is that not as big of a deal as people think?
No, I think it's definitely a valid consideration. I think things with like a high shear forces, so, you know, like a leg extension machine or something, those could potentially, you know, create like an environment that you might be more prone to a strain. It doesn't guarantee anything. Oh, if you do this, you're going to pull something. But also, like, I was always told people needed to avoid heavy overhead lifts. So yeah, don't maybe work on your snatch max in month 8. You know, that's probably not a good idea. But that, again, those just come back to, because these hormones, they circulate around the whole body. They're not just isolated in the pelvic region where the birth canal is. You know, they're circulating around the whole body. So yeah, your shoulders might be a little looser, and your knees, and your, you know, so it's just,
and shoulders are already a pretty unstable joint in general.
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense. That's interesting. I didn't know that, actually. Awesome. What are some other considerations that people should make maybe in their training program around pregnancy? Is there a point where, you know, maybe you should pull back on the Olympic lifts that people are doing throughout that process? Or is it really just kind of look at the symptoms and see how you're feeling?
I think if people's technique is good, they could probably continue those movements, pretty far into pregnancy. I think maybe what needs to adjust is not the exercise selection, but more like the loading and the volume. So, don't go nuts. You're not your body's different than it was pre-pregnancy. And so I think, again, get back to common sense. But also, if things don't feel right, or if there's some pain involved, yeah, stop. It's not worth it. But I think as long as technique is good, and the minor adjustments that need to be made to technique due to the, as the body's shape is changing, I think it's okay. I mean, well, that one picture I had in my talk, it was a woman doing a kettlebell snatch. Okay, maybe that's going to work a little better than doing a bar snatch.
Yeah.
And then that way the loading would automatically be a little less, and because it was a single arm type of thing. So yeah, it's continue lifting and the movements, but maybe think about, okay, maybe I'll do, single side movements instead of, compound both sides movements.
It does still seem like there's a lot of individual variability, where some people might gain a ton of weight while they're pregnant, where others might gain, only 10 or 15 pounds or something like that. And so it seems like that there's a lot of room, again, when it, like we talked about with menstrual cycle as well, that there's a huge individual variable when it comes to that, where some people are going to feel a lot better potentially training, where others are maybe going to feel a lot worse, even in the same kind of circumstances. Would you agree with that, Travis?
Absolutely. And I think I guess I can't overemphasize that whole needs analysis. It's like, okay. And I know that's daunting to people because they think, well, I'm coaching X number of athletes. I don't have time to, do a separate program for every one of them. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But I think just getting back to, okay, what are your primary things here? You want to get stronger. You want to get more powerful. You want to, those are kind of universal. So you don't have to make big changes there. It's just these more subtle changes to certain, movements that would then enable somebody to keep going. And so, yeah, it's taking just that little bit of extra time to, just to communicate about the individual things that are happening. It doesn't mean the massive changes to their programming, but just factoring that in.
That makes sense. And then I realized what my question was. What are some of the big benefits of training and continuing to train through pregnancy when it comes to strength training and even power training?
Well, I mean, there's the obvious, because if you stop training, you're going to detrain. And so then you got a longer road to get back to things. But I don't think there's good studies out there about if it really helps with the birth process or not. But I think it could help with just maintaining a healthy weight during pregnancy, because like Calvin just mentioned, there's a wide variability in the amount of weight that people do gain. And that does put stresses on the body. People that gain a lot of weight, they might end up with this, preeclampsia, which is, issues with like blood pressure, or they might end up with gestational diabetes, which is basically you go into a diabetic state while during pregnancy. And neither of those things, those are kind of hard on the body. And yeah, it's not something that's permanent, but if you're able to keep training and that could help with those kind of things, but also just the recovery from the whole, changes, not just the birth process, but just all the changes that happen during pregnancy. Cause it's 9 months of body changes, getting back to, your pre-pregnancy, condition. I think it can certainly help make that transition a lot easier.
I mean, that makes sense. If you maintain training through a longer period of time, it'll be hopefully easier in the recovery process back to at least back to where you were, possibly even beyond that, like we're seeing with some athletes right now. That's interesting.
Yeah, last we actually shouted out an athlete sometimes we do a shout outs section. There was an athlete that competed at nationals, and she trained all through her pregnancy. And she she actually squatted an 80% all-time back squat on the day she went into labor, like that
Oh,
morning.
wow. Yeah.
And then she did really great at nationals. She ended up hitting like a PR snatch, competition snatch at nationals. Probably was it 7 months postpartum? Is that what it was,
I
Bernice?
believe so.
Yeah.
So yeah, so maintaining her training throughout that helped her get back to it super quick to even getting that snatch PR. It's like, wow, that's amazing.
Because I think, we somehow along the way, we started treating pregnancy as, like this is extreme, like a disease, oh, there's something wrong with you. You need to rest, and I think, if you look at historically the evolution of human beings, people didn't just sit around and, when they became pregnant, they still did everything they, had to do to survive, in terms of, think back to way back in the day. So, but yeah, and there's plenty of examples of, female athletes who have, multiple children, and they're still competing at elite level. And, I think I feel quite confident in saying that most of them probably trained for a good proportion of their pregnancy, at least to some level. Maybe they backed off, but they were still doing something. They didn't just take that time completely off.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a good way to think about that for a lot of you guys is that it might be a really good time to kind of build a good base of volume and strength during that whole process. And maybe you won't be peaking your Olympic lifts as much, but you might be able to get some good work in that will set you up later on as well, which is kind of cool. Awesome. So we had some kind of rapid fire questions planned for you, but we ended up actually covering a lot of those throughout this whole interview. So I really appreciate it. I guess the final question that I wanted to ask you is what are some new things that are coming down the pipeline that you are interested in, whether that's on a research perspective or just in things that you're currently interested in when it comes to weightlifting and strength and conditioning?
Well, and I don't know if interested in is the right word, but I think just being aware of, AI is here.
Mm.
And I know this is sounding like it's way off topic, but I see students and they're, you can even Google, or I don't know if it's whatever AI Gemini or something. That will spit out a training program. And to me, that's a little scary because, we need to be, people have expertise for a reason. And so I just, in terms of just the field in general and how much information is out there, and a lot of it, is good, but a lot of it's also not good. And just, how those types of things are impacting training and coaching and whatever. And then just as I've gotten older, I think just, realizing that some stuff is simply that it's just fundamental, and all the fancy this and that is really, when you come back to fundamentals, that's really where you need to be, at least, starting out. And then, so I'm just more aware of those things now and how that may impact our field going forward and how people train and coach other people. And so, because there's some good uses of technology and information out there, but there's also some bad uses. And so I think that's I'm just tuning into that and thinking about how I can better train people who will go out and be practitioners to kind of navigate things going forward.
That's interesting because we actually just booked a guest who has developed a major AI platform in weightlifting. So this will be interesting to get his perspective on it too, and see how he's doing things.
Yeah, and like I said, there's some great uses for it, but then there's also some times where it could go wrong. So yeah, that would be very interesting, I think, to hear what he has to say.
Absolutely. Yeah. We had somebody I talked to recently said that their whole program was ChatGPT generated. And I was like, well, maybe that's why I see you missing so often on your on your Instagram story. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I just wanted to take the time again to say thank you so much for doing this podcast. I really appreciate it. And for anybody who's listening, where can people reach out to you or find out more about your work?
I welcome any communication if people have questions and stuff.
Perfect. Yeah, and we'll link that down in the description below for who does want to get in contact with you. Awesome. And then Calvin, where can people find you?
At Calvin Lackey, 81 kg on everything.
And you guys can find me at Big Ben Strength on everything. And make sure to check out our programs and free guides and stuff down in the description below. We'll catch you guys next week. Bye.